A single father breaks down in a hospital waiting room until a mysterious billionaire widow sits beside him, offering comfort, connection, and a second chance neither of them saw coming. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The hospital lights were too bright, too white, too clean. They buzzed faintly overhead, a soft hum that grated on Jack Callahan's nerves the longer he sat beneath them. His fingers were clenched around Emily's stuffed bunny, its ears frayed, fur matted from too many nights hugged tight. It didn't belong in a sterile waiting room. It belonged in a little girl's arms rising and falling gently with each breath. But right now, those breaths were a fight. He leaned forward, elbows digging into his knees, eyes fixed on the double doors that led to the emergency wing. They'd swung shut over an hour ago. Every time someone in scrubs passed through, his chest tightened, his breath caught, and his heart begged for news. Any news. Emily had been fine that morning, laughing, singing off-key to some song on the radio, her tangled curls bouncing as she packed her school bag, and then, suddenly, she wasn't. One wheeze turned into another, then a gasp, then the terrifying realization that she couldn't catch her breath. Jack had barely remembered the drive here, only the flashing hazard lights and the way her little hand clutched his, limp and trembling. He squeezed the bunny tighter, knuckles whitening. It was all too familiar, emergency rooms, urgent whispers, the slow-motion blur of people moving too fast. He'd been here once before, different hospital, different room, different life. He remembered holding his wife's hand until it went still. "Not again," he whispered, voice cracking. The waiting room was nearly empty, save for a tired-looking nurse behind the desk and an elderly man dozing in the corner. Jack felt invisible, like the world kept turning while his own had ground to a halt. His phone buzzed in his pocket, work probably, or a bill reminder he didn't want to see. He ignored it. Nothing mattered right now but the child behind those doors. He scrubbed a hand down his face, eyes stinging. He didn't care if anyone saw. He'd held it together in front of Emily. Now he didn't have to. And so, in that too-bright waiting room, with the stuffed bunny clutched like a lifeline, Jack Callahan cried, for fear, for exhaustion, and for a little girl fighting to breathe. Grace Whitmore didn't know why she walked into the hospital that morning. She hadn't meant to. The driver had been waiting to take her downtown for a meeting she didn't care about, to a room full of men who would pretend not to notice she still wore her wedding band. But something about the cold air and the silence in her penthouse had pressed against her chest until she needed to move. Just go anywhere. The hospital had pulled at her in a way she couldn't explain. She hadn't stepped inside one since Nathan died, since the machine stopped beeping, since the world tilted sideways and never quite righted itself. She told herself she was just making a donation in person. Walking in, speaking to someone, shaking a hand, something simple, something she could control. But when she passed the pediatric wing, her eyes caught on the man sitting alone in the waiting room, hunched over, clutching a worn stuffed bunny like it was the last real thing in the world. His shoulders were tight with grief, his back bowed, his face turned downward. The way his hand gripped the toy, it wasn't casual, it was survival. Something inside her paused. Grace wasn't the kind of woman who interrupted strangers. She had mastered distance, built her life on walls of composure, but her feet moved without asking, and before she knew it, she was sitting down on the plastic chair beside him. She didn't speak right away, neither did he. The silence between them stretched, not awkward, but heavy. His breath trembled. Hers matched it. "I'm sorry," she said softly after a while. Her voice was low, sincere. "I don't know what you're going through, but I know what it's like to wait." The man looked up, just briefly. Red-rimmed eyes, unshaven jaw, shoulders too big for one man to carry alone. He didn't ask who she was or why she was there. He just nodded once. Grace didn't offer false hope or platitudes. She just sat beside him, still and quiet, a presence in a space where everything felt empty. Sometimes the smallest kindness isn't in the words you say, but in the silence you share. The coffee was stale, burnt, really. The kind that sat too long in a metal carafe and turned bitter with time. But Jack Callahan drank it anyway, more for the warmth in his hands than the taste on his tongue. The vending machine had taken his last crumpled dollar, and the styrofoam cup felt almost insulting in its fragility, like it might collapse if he held it too tight. Beside him, the woman with the calm eyes and expensive coat sipped hers like it was a ritual. Grace, she'd said her name was. Grace Whitmore. It didn't ring a bell, though something about her seemed familiar, too put together for this place, too polished for the squeaky waiting room chairs and off-white linoleum. Still, she hadn't tried to fix anything. She hadn't said, "She'll be okay," or "Everything happens for a reason." She just sat with him, offered him coffee, and didn't flinch when he wiped his eyes on his sleeve. Jack cleared his throat, voice rough from hours of silence. "You don't have to stay, you know." "I know," she said, not looking away. "But I want to." He wasn't sure what to do with that. Most people ran from grief. They crossed the street to avoid it, filled conversations with weather talk and forced laughter. But Grace, she looked at it straight on, like she recognized it. He took another sip of the bitter brew. "My daughter's name is Emily. She's 7. Asthma attack came out of nowhere." Grace nodded gently. "I'm sorry." Jack glanced at her, then down at the bunny still sitting between them. "Her mom passed away 3 years ago. I still don't really know how to do all this alone." A soft breath escaped Grace's lips. "I lost my husband last year," she said, her voice like glass, clear and delicate. "And I still wake up expecting to hear him making coffee." Something shifted between them then, not something big or loud, just a small click, like a puzzle piece finding its place. They didn't say much after that. They didn't need to. 2 people, 2 coffees, and a quiet understanding that, in this strange, in-between moment, neither of them had to carry everything alone. A nurse emerged from behind the double doors, her scrubs wrinkled and shoes scuffed with the wear of too many hours on her feet. Jack shot to his feet before she even said his name, the half-empty coffee cup falling to the floor, forgotten. "Jack Callahan?" she asked gently, already seeing the desperation in his eyes. He nodded, heart thundering against his ribs. "She's stable," the nurse said with a soft smile. "Her breathing's under control. The medication worked, and she's resting now." For a moment, Jack just stood there, frozen in place, like the words hadn't landed. Then he blinked, once, twice, and the breath that left his chest came out shaky, broken. He staggered back a step and dropped into the chair, burying his face in his hands. The sound he made wasn't loud, but it cracked something in the quiet space. It was relief, raw and trembling and messy. His shoulders shook as he exhaled everything he'd been holding in for the last few hours, maybe the last few years. Across the room, Grace watched from her seat, her fingers still wrapped around the cooling cup in her lap. She hadn't meant to stay this long, but something about Jack's fierce love had rooted her in place. The way he clung to a child's stuffed toy like it was armor. The way he spoke about Emily, not as a responsibility, but as his whole world. Now, watching him fall apart in the wake of good news, something pulled at her chest. Not pity, not sympathy, something deeper. Recognition, maybe, the kind that comes when you see someone love so deeply it terrifies them. Grace stood quietly, walked a few steps closer, but didn't interrupt. She just sat nearby, letting him have his moment, knowing better than to speak into it. Jack wiped his face, dragging his palm across red eyes. He didn't look at her, not yet. But she could see the change in his posture, a little straighter, a little lighter. Still worn, still weathered, but no longer hollow. In the space between heartbreak and healing, Grace saw something rare. A man holding on to love like it was the only thing that mattered. And, for the first time in a long while, she wondered what it might feel like to reach for it again. By the time Jack returned from Emily's room, the waiting area had emptied out. The nurse at the desk gave him a kind smile and a nod, but the chair where Grace had been sitting, just beside his, was now vacant. No half-finished coffee, no trace of perfume lingering in the air, just the faint echo of her presence, like a song that had ended too soon. He stood there for a second, unsure why the emptiness felt so heavy. Maybe it was because she'd said so little, but somehow made him feel more seen than anyone had in years. Maybe it was because when he'd been breaking, she hadn't turned away. She didn't try to fix him or rush him past the pain. She just sat still, like she understood it. Jack ran a hand through his hair and dropped into the chair she'd left behind, still warm from her body. He let his eyes drift to the spot where their coffees had sat side by side. One bitter, one untouched. He smiled faintly, remembering how she hadn't flinched when he'd talked about losing his wife. She hadn't filled the silence with hollow comfort. She'd let it be quiet. And somehow, in that quiet, she'd given him more than anyone had in years. He realized he didn't even know her last name, just Grace. A woman with tired eyes and a voice like still water. A woman who knew what it meant to wait in rooms like this and carry grief like a second skin. Jack stood, finally, and headed back toward Emily's room. She was asleep, her little chest rising and falling in a rhythm that made his heart ache with relief. He sat beside her, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Someone was watching over us tonight," he whispered. He didn't mean it in a spiritual sense. He meant her, Grace. He didn't know where she'd gone or if he'd ever see her again, but something about her lingered in his chest like a spark that refused to go out. She was gone, but not forgotten. The scent of hospital antiseptic still clung to Jack's clothes as he moved through his small, worn-down house. He hadn't really slept since bringing Emily home, just existed in a daze of gratitude and exhaustion. The doctor had said she was in the clear, for now. But there was always a but with asthma. Medication schedules, follow-ups, triggers to avoid, an inhaler on every surface. He carried the weight of it like a second job. Morning came too fast. The sun rose over the cracked pavement outside, turning frost to steam. Emily, still pale but chipper, sat at the kitchen table drawing something with purple markers while Jack stood over a pile of unopened bills, each envelope demanding more than he could afford to give. The water bill was late. The electricity bill was next. And then the hospital invoice would come like a tidal wave. He rubbed his temples, closing his eyes for just a second longer than a blink. His mechanic job at Harris Auto barely covered food and rent. There was no overtime left to pick up, and side jobs were drying up with the weather. "You okay, Daddy?" Emily asked softly. He looked up and forced a smile. "Yeah, Em, just thinking about grown-up stuff." She nodded solemnly, as if she understood. Maybe she did, more than she should. Later that day, Jack stood under the hood of a battered pickup at the shop, wrench in hand, but thoughts elsewhere. Grace kept slipping into his mind, uninvited, but not unwelcome. The way she had listened without flinching, the quiet steadiness in her eyes. He hadn't seen her leave. She hadn't said goodbye. But somehow she'd left a mark that hadn't faded. He didn't even know her full name. There was something about her, though, something that didn't fit the waiting room. Her coat had looked expensive, her voice polished, not rehearsed, but refined. She wasn't from around here, that much he knew, and yet she'd sat beside him like they'd known each other in another life. As the socket wrench slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor, Jack cursed under his breath and wiped the grease from his fingers. He was tired, broke, overwhelmed, and still, somewhere beneath all that, he couldn't stop wondering who Grace really was. The shop radio crackled in and out, caught somewhere between a country station and static, as Jack wiped his hands on a rag and leaned back from the undercarriage of an old Buick. The heater in the garage had given up the ghost 3 winters ago, and now the cold crept in through the concrete, numbing his fingers and stiffening his joints. "Hey, Callahan," Marcus called from the front counter, holding up a tablet. "You got a second?" Jack set down his wrench and trudged over, expecting another parts delay, or a customer complaint. Instead, Marcus turned the screen toward him. A headline stretched across the top, bold and glossy. Grace Whitmore returns to public eye 1 year after husband's death. Below it, a photo, her photo. That same calm, poised face that had sat beside him in the waiting room. Same hair pulled back in a simple knot. Same steady eyes. Jack blinked, caught between disbelief and something that felt like being sucker punched. "Wait, that's her," he said quietly, more to himself than to Marcus. "You know Grace Whitmore?" Marcus asked, eyebrows shooting up. "She's like a billionaire. Runs that luxury design brand. What's it called? Whitmore Atelier? Married to Nathan Whitmore. Or was, I guess." Jack didn't answer right away. He was still staring at the photo, his chest tight. In the picture, she wore the same expression she'd had in the hospital, composed, distant, like her thoughts were always a few steps ahead of the moment. But now, seeing her like this, in a designer coat flanked by headlines and cameras, it felt like staring at someone from another world entirely. "She didn't say anything," Jack murmured. "Just said her name was Grace. Sat with me. Brought me coffee." Marcus whistled low. "Man, you sure she wasn't a hallucination?" Jack didn't laugh. He couldn't. Because now everything made a strange kind of sense. How polished she looked, the quiet sadness in her voice, the weight she carried so gracefully. She wasn't just some kind stranger. She was Grace Whitmore. And Jack Callahan had no idea what he was supposed to do with that. The hospital smelled the same, antiseptic and soft linen tinged with something warmer this time. Hope, maybe. Grace stepped through the glass doors with careful steps, her heels muffled against the polished floor. She wore her usual armor, tailored coat, silk scarf, and the subtle lipstick that made people think she was fine. But under it all, her hands trembled just slightly as she clutched the donation envelope. It had been a year since she last walked these halls in grief, and only a week since she'd sat in the waiting room beside a man whose pain mirrored her own in ways she hadn't expected. Jack Callahan. She hadn't planned to come back, not really. The donation was scheduled weeks ago, her assistant had arranged the press release, and the hospital board had already drafted their thanks. It should have been simple, but as soon as she stepped inside, her eyes drifted, not to the administrator waiting to greet her, not to the camera crew setting up near the front desk, but toward the pediatric wing. She was supposed to be here for the ribbon cutting. Instead, she found herself moving quietly down the corridor, drawn not by obligation, but by memory. She passed the waiting room where she'd first seen him, hunched over, gripping a child's stuffed bunny like it could stop the world from breaking. The chair where she'd sat was empty now, but the silence felt the same, heavy, real. Grace hesitated outside room 214. The door was slightly ajar. Inside she saw him, Jack, his jacket draped over the back of a chair, sleeves stained with grease, hair still tousled from work. And there was Emily, curled up in the hospital bed, a coloring book open on her lap and an inhaler nearby. He was reading to her, voice low and steady, even as his eyes betrayed how tired he was. Grace didn't step in. She couldn't, not yet. But she stood there for a moment longer, unnoticed, something warm blooming in her chest, something dangerously close to longing. She had come here to give, but she hadn't expected to want something back. Jack didn't know how she found them. He never asked. 1 minute, he was double-knotting Emily's sneakers in the hospital lobby, and the next, Grace Whitmore was standing there with a soft smile and a question that caught him off guard. "Have you two eaten?" He opened his mouth to protest, say something about bills, time, pride. But before he could speak, Emily looked up with wide eyes and nodded enthusiastically. "Tacos," she whispered, like it was a sacred word. So there they were, sitting in a corner booth at a small cafe just off Main Street, Grace with a linen napkin folded neatly in her lap, Jack hunched over a chipped plate of carnitas, and Emily giggling between bites of rice and beans. Jack had never felt more out of place. Not because Grace made him feel small, she didn't, but because everything about her screamed a world he didn't belong to. Her quiet elegance, the way she listened, the way she saw everything. Still, there was no camera crew, no staff, just Grace. And somehow, that made all the difference. Emily was smitten. She peppered Grace with questions between mouthfuls of guacamole. What's your favorite animal? Do you like cartoons? Have you ever ridden a horse? Grace answered everyone with patience and a soft laugh, like she wasn't a billionaire in a borrowed moment, but someone who'd been waiting for this conversation her whole life. Jack watched them, arms crossed, half listening and half guarded. It wasn't suspicion exactly, it was disbelief. This woman, who had no reason to come back, no obligation to sit in this booth, was laughing with his daughter like they belonged here, like she wanted to be here. "Thank you," he said finally, voice rougher than he meant. Grace looked at him and smiled. "For what?" "For this," he said, gesturing gently toward Emily, who was now trying to teach Grace a ridiculous hand-clap game. "For showing up again." Her smile faded just enough to show the truth behind it. "I know what it's like to feel alone," she said quietly, "and what it means when someone doesn't let you." Jack didn't have an answer to that, but as Emily reached over and tugged his sleeve, beaming with nacho-stained lips, he felt something ease inside him, something warm, something unfamiliar. Maybe this wasn't just a meal. Maybe it was the start of something more. The cough started in the middle of the night, a soft, rasping sound that pulled Jack from sleep like a fire alarm. He was up before he even registered it, stumbling into Emily's room to find her sitting upright in bed, clutching her chest with wide, watery eyes. Her inhaler was on the nightstand. He grabbed it, steadied her hands, counted her breaths, but something was off, worse than before. The wheezing didn't fade like it usually did. Her small body trembled with each labored inhale. Jack didn't waste time. Within minutes, they were in the car, the heater blasting against the early morning frost as he tore through town toward the hospital again, heart pounding louder than the engine. At the ER, the nurses recognized them. That was both a comfort and a gut punch. By mid-morning, Emily was stable again, but Jack felt like he'd aged 10 years in a few hours. He sat in the hospital cafeteria with a paper cup of coffee, head in his hands, when his phone buzzed. Grace Whitmore. He hadn't saved the number. He didn't need to. Her name lit up his screen like something out of place. He hesitated, then answered. "Is she okay?" Grace asked, skipping past greetings. "Yeah," Jack said, rubbing a hand over his face. "Better now?" There was a pause, and then, "I have a car nearby. Let me send it for you both. You shouldn't have to worry about getting home right now." He exhaled slowly. "That's kind of you, but—" "Jack," her voice was calm but firm, "let me help." Silence stretched between them. He hated how tired he was, how much the offer made sense, how badly he didn't want to say yes, and how much he needed to. He closed his eyes. "All right, just this once." An hour later, a sleek black sedan pulled into the hospital pickup lane. The driver stepped out, called him by name, held the door open like they were royalty. Jack settled Emily in gently, covering her with a blanket as she drifted off again. Sitting beside her in that impossibly smooth car, Jack stared out the tinted window, jaw tight. He didn't like relying on anyone, but something about Grace's quiet insistence didn't feel like charity. It felt like care, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. The fire in Grace's hearth crackled softly, casting golden light across the polished marble and high ceilings of the penthouse. Outside, the city blinked below them, distant, alive, and somehow entirely unreachable. Jack sat on the edge of a leather chair that probably cost more than his truck, shoulders stiff, hands resting on his knees like he didn't know where to put them. Emily was asleep in the guest room, her soft breathing monitored by a small digital baby monitor Grace had placed on the table without comment. Jack had tried to refuse the overnight stay, but she had looked at him and said, "She's safe here. Let her rest." And he had no fight left. Now they sat across from each other, cups of tea cooling between them. "This place is—" Jack began, gesturing vaguely. It's like something out of a movie. Grace smiled faintly. It doesn't feel like it. He looked at her, eyebrows raised. She folded her hands in her lap, staring into the fire. It used to feel full. Nathan, my husband, he filled up a room just by being in it. He could make a penthouse feel like a cottage. Now, she trailed off, eyes unfocused. It echoes. Jack nodded slowly. I know that sound. Grace turned to him. You lost someone too. My wife, he said softly. 3 years ago. Car accident. She was coming back from the grocery store. I was home with Emily. We'd just run out of peanut butter. Grace's lips parted. A breath caught on sympathy. But she didn't speak. She let him keep going. She was bright, always had something to say, laughed too loud. She'd dance in the kitchen with Emily every Saturday morning, whether there was music or not. Grace blinked slowly, as if memorizing every word. I held it together for Emily, Jack said. But it never really got easier. You just learned to carry it differently. They sat in silence, the kind that felt thick, but not uncomfortable. Shared. Understood. Grace leaned back slightly, looking up at the ceiling. People think money softens loss, she murmured, but it doesn't. It just buys better distractions. Jack let out a quiet, humorless laugh. Yeah, grief's an equal opportunity bastard. Their eyes met. For the first time since their paths crossed, they weren't strangers anymore. They were two people who had both loved deeply and lost just as hard. The gate squeaked every time it closed. Not a small, ignorable sound, but a long, metallic wail that echoed through the manicured gardens of Grace's estate, like something out of a haunted house. Grace barely noticed it anymore, but Jack winced every time it groaned shut behind him. I can fix that, he said one morning, standing at the edge of the gravel driveway, with his hands in his jacket pockets. Grace tilted her head. It's just a gate, he shrugged. Even the small things get loud if you let them go too long. There was a pause, then a smile tugged at her lips. All right, Mr. Callahan, show me what you've got. She watched from the steps as he went to work, shoulders hunched, sleeves rolled, toolbox open beside him. It was strange, seeing someone so capable in a place where everything was usually done by silent staff and invoices. Jack didn't wait for approval. He just moved with purpose, the kind that came from years of doing what needed to be done without asking. You always carry tools with you? She called. He grinned without looking up. You don't? That made her laugh, an honest, easy sound that surprised even her. It wasn't just the gate. Soon it was the loose hinge on the sunroom door. Then the rattling in the laundry chute. Grace would mention something offhandedly, and Jack would nod, file it away, show up the next day with the right part in hand. It was never transactional. He didn't take payment, just coffee, conversation, the occasional sandwich. He came around more often than he probably meant to, and Grace never asked him to leave. One afternoon, as he stood tightening a bolt on the garden fence, Emily darted across the lawn, her laughter ringing out like music. Grace followed behind, slower, holding a pitcher of lemonade. She handed Jack a glass, brushing her hand against his for a moment too long. You keep this up, she said softly, and I'm going to start breaking things just to see you fix them. Jack chuckled, taking a sip, eyes lingering on her. Then I guess I'll keep showing up. And in that quiet exchange, without planning it, without naming it, something new began to take root between them, steady and simple, like the fixing of broken things. The clatter of tools and hum of engines usually drowned out the noise at Harris Auto, but lately it was the whispers that Jack heard most. Did you see who picked him up last week? Black car, tinted windows, definitely not from around here. I heard she owns like half of New York. Jack wiped grease from his hands and kept his head down, pretending not to hear. The guys at the shop weren't subtle, and the regular customers were even worse. Mrs. Dalton, who brought in her Buick every month, like clockwork, leaned over the counter and whispered, I saw that Whitmore woman drop off your little girl at school. Real classy. She yours now, or what? He gave her a tight smile and mumbled something about good people and neighbors helping each other, but inside the question stuck. He wasn't dating Grace. At least, not in any way he could define. She brought Emily books and healthy snacks, dropped by the shop with coffee for him. Sometimes they had dinner. Sometimes it turned into long talks on her rooftop, the city lights glowing behind her like a different galaxy. It wasn't nothing, but calling it something felt like stepping out onto a ledge with no handrail. "Hey, Jack," Marcus called from under the hood of a rusted Jeep. "She taking you to Paris next? You gonna come back with a tux and a new jawline?" Jack rolled his eyes. "You done? I'm just saying, you're like a walking Hallmark movie, man." The guys laughed. Jack didn't. Not because it bothered him, well, maybe a little, but because he didn't have an answer. Grace wasn't part of his world, and he damn well wasn't part of hers. But every time she looked at him like he mattered, like she saw him for more than his worn jeans and busted boots, it shook something loose inside him. That night, after closing the shop, Jack stood outside with a wrench still in his hand, watching the sky bleed into dusk. She wasn't his, but she kept showing up, and maybe, just maybe, that meant something was happening after all. The envelope sat on the kitchen table like it didn't belong. Too pristine, too heavy for something that had arrived in Grace's delicate handwriting. Jack stared at it, arms crossed, jaw tight, his coffee untouched and growing cold beside him. Emily was in the other room, humming to herself while she drew rainbows on construction paper. The house smelled faintly of toast and crayons. Normal, familiar, safe. But nothing about the envelope felt that way. He opened it slowly, already knowing what was inside. The note was brief, Grace's handwriting clean and graceful, like everything else about her. "Let me do this. It's not charity. It's care. Grace." Folded behind the note was a check. More than enough to cover Emily's hospital bills. Every last dollar. Jack stood still for a long time, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. It wasn't the first time someone had offered help. After his wife died, people had brought casseroles, offered to mow the lawn, slipped a 20 into his jacket pocket just in case. But this was different, bigger, heavier, and it felt like a crack in the wall he'd spent years building. He didn't wait. He grabbed his phone, hit Grace's name, and stepped outside, the screen glowing against the early evening sky. She picked up on the second ring. "Jack?" "I can't take it." There was a pause on her end, but her voice came calm and even. "It's not alone." "I know. And I'm not doing this to make myself feel better." "I know that too," he said, quieter now. "Then why won't you let me help?" He closed his eyes, running a hand over his jaw. "Because if I do, I don't know what that makes me. I've gotten by this far, just me and Emily. If I take your money, what am I?" "Human," she said gently. "Someone who doesn't have to carry everything alone." Her words were kind, sincere, and that made it worse. "I can't," he whispered. Grace didn't argue. She didn't beg. She just said, "Okay." Jack hung up and stared at the envelope in his hand. Pride was a heavy thing, and sometimes it weighed more than reason. The days passed slowly. Jack buried himself in work, longer hours at the shop, extra jobs no one else wanted, oil changes, tire rotations, busted transmissions, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind quiet. But in the still moments when the tools were down and the shop lights dimmed, she crept in. "Grace?" He didn't text, didn't call. He told himself it was better this way. That space would help him clear the fog in his chest. But the truth was, he missed her. Missed the way her voice softened when she talked to Emily, the way she laughed with restraint, like she'd forgotten how and was just now remembering. Missed the way her silence wasn't empty. It was full of things that mattered. Each evening, Jack found himself sitting on the porch with a beer in hand, staring at the dark sky, waiting for something he couldn't name. Her car didn't come, her name didn't light up his phone, and yet he checked anyway. Across town, Grace sat alone at her grand dining table. a dozen candles flickering against the cold marble. The food tasted bland, untouched. Her assistant had scheduled a week full of meetings, interviews, business dinners, things that used to matter once. But every room felt hollow. The penthouse was too quiet again, even with the city alive outside the windows. She hadn't realized how much Jack's rough edges had softened her days, how Emily's small voice had filled the spaces grief had carved out. She'd made the mistake of caring, and now, with no messages, no visits, and no explanations, she didn't know how to undo it. Was it the money, the offer? Had she crossed a line too finely drawn? She didn't know how to chase someone who was used to standing alone, and Jack didn't know how to let someone reach for him without feeling like he owed the world. So they didn't call, didn't speak, and in the silence between them, something fragile trembled, waiting, wondering, aching to be named. The snow had come early that year, thick and quiet, blanketing the town in white like someone had gently pressed pause on the world. Jack stood at the window, coffee mug in hand, watching Emily in the front yard, bundled in 3 layers too many, her tiny figure barely visible beneath a puffed-up pink coat and hat. She trudged through the snow like a determined explorer, stomping patterns into the untouched drifts. Her boots were too small. He'd noticed the week before, but new ones weren't in the budget yet. He'd told her to double up on socks. She hadn't complained. He took a sip of his coffee and sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. It had been a week since he'd seen Grace, 7 long, quiet days that stretched wider with each sunrise. He'd told himself it was the right thing to put space between them, but space, it turned out, was lonely. Then a sleek black SUV turned slowly onto his street, tires crunching over snow. Jack froze. He didn't need to see the driver to know. The engine cut off, and Grace stepped out, carefully balancing 2 cups in one gloved hand and a large paper bag in the other. She was wrapped in a dark wool coat, snowflakes gathering in her hair as she made her way up the walk. Jack opened the door before she could knock. "Hey," she said, breath curling in the air between them. "You didn't have to come all the way out here," he said, though his voice lacked any real protest. She offered a small, sheepish smile. "I heard it snowed. Figured Emily's feet might appreciate these more than layered socks." She held out the bag. Inside, a brand-new pair of snow boots, purple, with glittery laces and faux fur lining. They looked warm, expensive, perfect. "And hot cocoa," she added, lifting the cup slightly. "One for you, one with extra marshmallows." Jack hesitated, then stepped aside. Emily squealed from the yard the moment she spotted her. "Grace!" As the little girl barreled toward them, Jack glanced at Grace. Her expression was open, unsure, hopeful. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, voice nearly lost in the wind. "I didn't mean to cross a line. I just missed you." He nodded slowly, taking the cocoa from her hand. "I missed you too," he admitted. And just like that, the space between them began to melt. The backyard was quiet except for the soft creak of the porch swing and the distant hum of crickets beneath the snow-dusted trees. Jack had strung up the old bulb lights weeks ago, leftovers from a neighborhood Christmas the year before, and tonight, under the fading winter dusk, they flickered to life like stars someone had bothered to hang just for them. Emily was asleep inside, curled up with a storybook and her new snow boots still on. She'd refused to take them off, even under her blanket. Jack had carried her to bed with a smile tugging at his mouth, heart fuller than he remembered it being in a long time. Grace stood at the edge of the porch, hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, eyes lifted to the glow of the lights overhead. She looked peaceful in the cold, her breath rising in soft clouds, her features relaxed in a way they rarely were in the city. "I like it out here," she said quietly. Jack leaned against the railing, watching her instead of the sky. "It's not much." "It's honest," she replied, turning to meet his gaze. "That's more than most places." There was music playing faintly from the old radio in the kitchen, some slow tune Jack couldn't name, something with a gentle rhythm and a voice like smoke. It drifted out the open window and settled around them like the snow. He stepped forward, tentative. "May I?" Grace raised an eyebrow, but her smile gave her away. "You're asking me to dance?" Jack shrugged. "We've done coffee, cocoa, crisis. Figure we're overdue for something simple." She didn't hesitate long. With gloved hands and quiet laughter, she took his. He pulled her close, and they moved slowly beneath the backyard lights, the snow a soft crunch beneath their feet. There were no grand declarations, no promises whispered into the cold air. Just two people swaying in the quiet, her cheek resting gently against his shoulder, his hands steady on her waist. The space between them was gone now, filled not with words, but with presence. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The past had a way of showing up when you least expected it, uninvited, unwelcome, and impossible to ignore. Grace sat at the long mahogany table in the Whitmore Foundation boardroom, the polished surface reflecting her composed expression as her late husband's sister, Veronica, pursed her lips and folded her arms across her designer blazer. "I saw the photos," Veronica said flatly. "You, him, the child. What are you doing, Grace?" Grace kept her voice calm, even, as always. His name is Jack, and her name is Emily." Veronica let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "So now you're playing house in the suburbs? With a mechanic?" "It's not a game," Grace replied, "and I don't owe you an explanation." "But you do owe the foundation one," Veronica shot back. "You're still the public face of this family. Whitmore carries weight, and people notice when you start spending time with people like him." Grace didn't flinch. People like him are why the foundation exists. But later, in the quiet of her car, the words echoed, "People like him," as if Jack was some project, as if what they were building could be dismissed so easily. She hated how familiar the feeling was, being measured by what people expected instead of who she was. Across town, Jack wasn't faring much better. He sat at the kitchen table of his late wife's parents, staring into a mug of lukewarm coffee while Susan, his mother-in-law, stared at him the way she had since their daughter's funeral, sad, searching, and slightly disappointed. "She's beautiful," Susan said, carefully neutral, "but she's not Anna." Jack nodded slowly. "I know. And you hardly know her. What do you really think this is?" "I think," he said, "she's kind and good to Emily. And for the first time in a long time, it feels like I can breathe again." Susan didn't argue, but the silence between them held its own kind of judgment. Later, when Jack stepped out into the fading light, he felt the weight of eyes on his back. Grace's past, his own, all of it pressing in. Loving someone new didn't erase the ghosts. It just meant learning how to live with them. The office windows stretched floor to ceiling, giving way to a skyline dusted in soft winter haze. Grace stood near the glass, arms crossed, watching the clouds drift between towers like smoke with nowhere to land. Behind her, the door clicked shut with quiet finality. Elliot Kane adjusted his tie as he entered, his sharp frame silhouetted by the clean lines of the room. He didn't need to announce himself. Grace knew that sound anywhere. 15 years of late meetings, working lunches, quiet dinners. That almost felt like more. Almost. "You wanted to talk?" she said without turning. "I wanted to ask what you're doing," Elliot replied, straightforward as ever. She turned then, leaning against the window. "I assume you're not referring to the quarterly numbers?" "You know I'm not." His voice wasn't angry, just concerned, tired, laced with something quieter, something old. "You've been seen with him again," he continued. "The photos are everywhere, online, in the industry gossip circuits, and while you might not care, your board does. Investors do." Grace exhaled. "Jack isn't a scandal, Elliot. He's a person, a good one. And yet he doesn't belong in your world." She raised a brow. "Neither did Nathan when I met him. Nathan built this world with you. Jack repairs brake pads in a town with one stoplight. He doesn't know who you are." "Yes, he does," she said, her voice low now. "He knows the parts that matter." Elliot stepped closer, jaw tightening. Grace, I've stood by you. Through Nathan's death. Through the press, the pressure. I've been here. I've watched you break and rebuild. And now, you're handing your heart to a man who might not be able to carry it. There it was. Not business, not concern, not really. Love. She heard it in the quiet drop of his voice, felt it in the way his hands didn't quite unclench. I never asked you to wait, she said gently. No, he murmured, but I did anyway. They stood in the silence that followed, him hoping, her already elsewhere. And somewhere beyond the glass, she pictured a man with grease on his hands and a girl with a laugh like spring. Elliot was the one who waited, but Jack was the one she was walking toward. The letter was tucked inside an old linen envelope, worn soft at the corners, edges yellowed by time. Grace hadn't opened it in over a year. Not since the night of Nathan's funeral, when she'd sat on the floor of their bedroom in her black dress in trembling silence, too hollow to cry. She kept it in her nightstand, beneath a stack of books she never finished and a drawer she rarely opened. But tonight, something pulled her to it. Maybe it was Elliot's words echoing in her mind, or the weight of Jack's name on her heart, unspoken but constant. Maybe it was the snow falling softly outside, the kind Nathan had always loved, quiet, clean, a world made new. Her fingers traced the familiar script on the envelope, for Grace, when you're ready. She unfolded it slowly, her breath shallow as the paper opened in her lap. My Grace, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And if I know you, it means you're sitting there trying to hold everything together, smiling for the world and falling apart inside. Don't, not for me. I loved you more than I ever knew how to say. You were the bright in every room, the stillness in every storm. But my leaving isn't the end of your story. It's a chapter, a painful, unfair, heart-wrenching chapter. But not the last. There will come a time when someone else makes you laugh the way I used to. Maybe slower, maybe gentler. Let them. Let someone see you, hold you, remind you what it feels like to belong. Love again, even if it breaks you, even if you think it dishonors me. It doesn't. It honors the life we built. It honors you. Don't live the rest of your life in a memory. You deserve more. All my heart always, Nathan. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them, quiet, steady, and real. She read the letter again and again until the ache in her chest stopped feeling like guilt and started feeling like release. That night, Grace didn't dream of penthouses or boardrooms or the life she used to have. She dreamt of Jack, of laughter in a small kitchen, of second chances, of love, breaking, healing, and beginning again. Jack was elbow-deep in an engine when he saw her. The shop door swung open, letting in a gust of late winter wind and the click of polished boots on concrete. Grace stood in the entry, her coat cinched tight, a spark in her eyes that didn't match the cold outside. Jack wiped his hands on a rag and stepped out from under the hood, brow furrowed in confusion. "You okay?" he asked, glancing behind her as if expecting bad news. "I have an idea," she said, stepping further inside. "And before you say anything, just hear me out." Jack raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "I'm listening." She took a breath. "What if I told you I wanted to build something with you, not for you, but with you, something that matters?" He leaned against the tool bench, arms crossed, waiting. "A non-profit auto training center," she said, words coming faster now, carried by momentum and quiet conviction. "A place for at-risk youth, teenagers who don't fit the college mold, kids who need a second shot at life, at skills, at dignity. We teach them the basics, repair, maintenance, diagnostics. But more than that, we give them community, purpose." Jack blinked, caught somewhere between admiration and disbelief. "I'd fund it," she added. "Secure the space, get the permits, cover startup costs. You'd run it, teach, mentor, be the heart of it." He let the words hang in the air. A garage, A second chance. A dream he'd never dared to say out loud. "Why me?" he asked finally quietly. Grace stepped closer. "Because I've seen the way you talk to people, the way you treat your customers, the way you've raised Emily with patience and grit. You don't just fix cars, Jack. You see people. You give them back a piece of themselves." He looked away, jaw tight, overwhelmed. "It's too much," he said. "Too big." "It's possible," she countered, "if you're willing." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he glanced at the open hood beside him, the engine halfway through a repair, and smiled just a little. "Okay," he said, "let's build something." And just like that, a dream Jack had never voiced began to take shape, not with blueprints, but with belief. The garage was quiet, except for the low hiss of a space heater and the occasional clang of tools being put away harder than necessary. Jack paced between the tool bench and the half-assembled training center mock-up Grace had helped him sketch on the wall 2 weeks ago. His hands were dirty, but he didn't care. His heart beat too fast for something that wasn't physical. Grace stood near the door, arms crossed, a folder in her hand, full of permits, grant paperwork, and proposals. She was calm, composed, but he could see the tension in her jaw, the kind she wore when she was holding back more than words. "You just dropped it in my lap," Jack said, voice tight. "A whole operation, building, funding, every connection in the city. You didn't even ask me what I wanted." She blinked. "You said yes." "I said yes to us building it, together, not you calling in favors and handing me keys like I'm a damn charity case." Her face paled slightly. "That's not what this is." "Isn't it?" His voice cracked. "You live in a world where problems get solved with money. I don't. I can't live like that." Grace's eyes hardened, the calm breaking beneath her words. "You think this is about money? Jack, I believed in this because of you. I've watched you fight for everything without ever asking for help. And now, the second someone believes in you, you twist it into an insult." He stepped back as if her words physically landed. "I didn't ask you to save me." "No," she said, her voice quieter now. "You didn't. But you never let anyone in either. You say you want something real, but the moment it gets close, you pull away like it's a threat." Jack stared at her, chest heaving, anger simmering beneath old wounds. Grace swallowed, gripping the folder tighter. "You're not the only one who's lost someone, Jack, but I'm here. I chose to be here." Silence stretched between them, too long, too heavy. Finally she turned to go, pausing at the door. "When you're ready to stop running," she said softly, "you know where to find me." Then she was gone, and all that remained was the quiet, the guilt, and the sound of dreams put on pause. The envelope was creased and uneven, folded with the careful clumsiness only small hands could manage. Grace found it on her doorstep late one afternoon, slipped under the front mat, edges damp from melting snow. There was no return address, just her name, scribbled in purple marker across the front. To Grace, from Emily. She stood in the foyer for a long moment, boots still on, scarf still wrapped around her neck. Then she peeled off her gloves and opened the letter slowly, as if it might break. Inside was a sheet of notebook paper, torn at the edges, the lines running crooked with crayon. "Dear Grace, thank you for the boots and the hot chocolate and the big hugs. Thank you for letting me watch the stars on your roof and for knowing how to braid hair better than Daddy. But mostly, thank you for making my Daddy smile again. He doesn't smile like that with anyone else, not even me. I think he misses you. I miss you too. Love, Emily." Grace sat down right there on the entryway bench, letter trembling in her hands. It wasn't the handwriting or the lopsided hearts drawn at the bottom that undid her. It was that one line, "Thank you for making my Daddy smile again." She hadn't realized how deeply she'd needed to hear it, that her presence had mattered, that she hadn't just wandered into Jack's life like some temporary warmth before the storm. She had doubted everything after their fight, the offer, the timing, the way Jack had looked at her like she'd touched a part of him too tender to name. She'd told herself she had overstepped, crossed a line that was never hers to cross. But Emily's words cut through that noise. They were pure, without agenda, without fear. And they reminded her of something she'd nearly forgotten. She hadn't come into their lives to rescue anyone. She had come because they had rescued something in her. Grace folded the letter gently, pressed it to her chest, and closed her eyes. The doubt didn't vanish, but in its place bloomed something stronger, hope. The cemetery was quiet in the way only winter could make it, snow muffling every sound, the wind whispering low through bare branches. Jack stood at the edge of the plot, hands deep in his coat pockets, boots sunk into the crust of fresh snow. The headstone hadn't changed. Simple, clean, the way Anna would have wanted. He hadn't been here in months, not because he forgot. He never forgot. But sometimes the weight of visiting made it harder, not easier. He talked to her often, just not here. Usually in the truck, or while brushing Emily's hair, or when the silence of the house felt too loud. But today, he needed the weight of the stillness, the presence of the place. He knelt slowly, brushing snow from the base of the stone with his glove. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice catching in the cold. "Been a while." He sat back on his heels, hands resting on his thighs. Emily's doing good, still wild, still stubborn. You'd love how she talks back now. She's got your fire. He paused, swallowed hard. "There's someone I need to tell you about." His voice dropped to a whisper, like he wasn't sure the world should hear what came next. "Her name's Grace. She's different. She's not trying to replace anything. She doesn't need to. But when she's around, the air feels lighter. And Emily, she lights up like Christmas lights when Grace walks in the room." He looked down, eyes stinging. "I didn't expect this. I wasn't looking for it. And I swear, if there was a way to ask for your permission, I would. But she makes me feel like I can breathe again, like I don't have to hold my breath through the good days anymore." Jack exhaled, long and slow, like he was letting go of something that had lived in his ribs for years. "I'll always love you. That won't change. But maybe there's room for something more now. Not instead of you, just next to you." He stood slowly, brushing the snow from his knees, and looked down at the stone one last time. "Thank you," he whispered, "for teaching me what love feels like, so I could recognize it again." Then he turned, walked through the snow, and let the wind carry his words into the silence behind him. The diner was nearly empty, save for the soft clink of cutlery and the hum of an old jukebox in the corner playing a tune no one really remembered. It wasn't fancy. Linoleum floors, cracked vinyl booths, coffee that always tasted slightly burnt. But it was neutral. No penthouse ceilings, no garage grease, just a place in between, a place where they could meet without the weight of what had passed hanging over either of them. Jack sat by the window, hands wrapped around a chipped mug. He hadn't touched the coffee, not yet. His leg bounced under the table, nerves tightening every breath. He didn't know if she'd come. He wouldn't have blamed her if she didn't. But when the bell over the door rang and Grace stepped inside, snow melting on her coat, he felt something shift in his chest, like a string that had been wound too tight, finally loosening. She saw him and gave a small, cautious smile. No makeup, no entourage, just Grace. She slid into the booth across from him, shrugging off her coat, and for a moment they just sat there, the air between them thick with things unsaid. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Jack replied. Silence stretched, but not the kind that hurts, the kind that waits. "I read Emily's letter," she said quietly. "She has your heart." He nodded. "She's a better version of me." Grace smiled, then looked down at her hands. "I wasn't sure if I should come." "I wasn't sure if I should ask," he said. Then he took a breath. "But I had to." She looked up, waiting. "I've been carrying so much for so long," he said, voice low. "Grief, guilt, pride. I built walls thinking I was protecting what I had left, but all I did was shut everything else out, including you." Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't speak. "I want to try," Jack said, words finally falling free. "Not to replace what we lost, but to build something new, something honest, if you still do. Grace reached across the table and took his hand. "I never stopped," she whispered. No promises, no grand declarations, just two people starting over together. The banners were simple, white cloth, hand-painted letters that read, "Maplewood Community Auto Center, Opening Day." Folding chairs lined the parking lot, snow shoveled to the side, leaving behind damp patches that caught the early spring sun. Neighbors showed up in flannel and faded jeans, clutching coffee cups and curiosity. A few teenagers lingered near the garage doors, wide-eyed at the rows of shiny new tools and spotless lifts. Jack stood off to the side, adjusting the collar of his shirt for the third time. He wasn't used to speeches, wasn't used to being the center of anything, really. But today, this day, was different. Grace stood a few feet away, talking to a city official with that same easy grace that had once unnerved him. Now, it anchored him. She caught his eye and gave a quiet nod, reassuring, steady. When Jack stepped up to the mic, the murmurs died down. He cleared his throat, glanced once at the folded paper in his hand, then tucked it into his pocket. "I had something written down," he began, voice low but clear, "but I figure this place deserves something real." He looked out at the crowd, at the kids in the back, at Emily sitting front row beside Grace, swinging her legs and beaming. "This started with an idea I didn't believe I was worthy of," he said. "A dream I never said out loud because dreams don't always feel like they belong to guys like me, but someone believed in it and in me before I did." He glanced toward Grace, and she blinked fast, lips pressed together. "This center isn't just about cars. It's about second chances. For kids who've been told they're too much or not enough. For the ones who never got handed anything but still show up anyway. We're here to teach skills, sure. But more than that, we're here to say, you matter. You're not alone. You're worth the work." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Jack smiled, just a little. "If I can build something like this, after everything, then maybe there's hope for anyone." Applause rose like a wave. Grace wiped a tear. Emily stood and clapped the hardest of all. And just like that, what started as a garage became something much bigger. The headline hit the newsstands before Jack even knew there was a story. "Billion-dollar Grace, Whitmore heiress, finds love in small-town mechanic." Below it, a photo, him and Grace standing outside the community auto center, her hand gently resting on his arm, both of them smiling, unaware anyone was watching. By the time he pulled into the shop that morning, Marcus was waving a copy of the paper like it was on fire. Dude, you made page 1." Jack stared at the cover for a long beat, his gut tightening, not because he was ashamed, but because he knew what came next. He'd seen it before, how people twist what they don't understand. It started with whispers in the diner. Then came the stares at the gas station. Customers hesitated a little longer before handing over their keys. Some were kind. "Good for you, Jack. Didn't know you had it in you." But others weren't so generous. "Bet she'll get bored soon. What's someone like her doing with someone like him? He's riding her coattails, that's all." He tried to laugh it off, shrugged when people asked if it was true, ignored the looks that followed him like shadows. But by midweek, it wore him down. He found Grace waiting outside the shop after closing, leaning against her car, sunglasses perched on her head, and a calm expression that didn't match the storm he felt brewing inside. "You seen it?" he asked, stepping out with grease still on his hands. She nodded. "Of course." Jack looked away. "You weren't supposed to get dragged into this." Grace stepped closer, voice firm. "I didn't get dragged. I walked in, eyes wide open." "You're a headline now," he said bitterly. "You know what they're calling me?" "I don't care what they're calling you," she said, reaching for his hand. "I care what you believe." He looked at her, jaw tight. "I believe I don't belong in your world." She smiled softly. "Then let's make a new one, together." The headlines kept coming, but Grace never flinched. And Jack, slowly, steadily, stopped apologizing for being seen. The stars were scattered thick across the sky that night, clear and sharp, like someone had dusted diamonds over deep velvet. The cold air bit at Jack's skin, but he barely noticed. They stood in the backyard of Grace's country cottage, the one she'd quietly purchased just outside of town, away from the eyes and cameras, the noise and pressure. She'd invited him for dinner, just the two of them, no agenda, no press, no expectations. Now they stood side by side beneath the string lights Jack had helped hang along the old wooden fence, their glow soft and golden in the dark. Emily had fallen asleep hours ago, tucked in with a story and her bunny under one of Grace's old cashmere throws. Inside, the fire still crackled, but neither of them had moved to go in. Grace looked up at the sky. "Do you think people ever get tired of stars?" Jack glanced at her, half smiling. "Not the smart ones." She turned toward him, her breath visible in the cold. Her expression was open, softer than usual. There was no trace of armor tonight, no business tone, no polished walls, just Grace. The woman who had sat beside him when he was breaking. The woman who had given him room to heal and dared to stay. "I've been waiting," she said quietly, voice barely louder than the breeze. "For what?" "For you," she said. "To stop second-guessing, to see what I already do." Jack stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. "I wasn't sure I was allowed to want this." She didn't answer with words. She looked at him, really looked, and then slowly reached up, her fingers resting gently on his cheek. He leaned in, hesitant for only a heartbeat. And then they kissed, not rushed, not uncertain, but slow, sure, and full of everything they hadn't said. It was the kind of kiss that didn't ask for anything, but gave everything in return. The kind that stitched together what had been frayed. The kind that said finally, without ever speaking. When they pulled apart, the stars still shimmered above them, but something between them had changed. They were no longer waiting. It started with a cough. Jack had heard it before, too many times to count, but this one was different, deeper, tighter. Emily clutched her chest as her breathing quickened, her eyes wide with fear that mirrored his own. It was like time folded in on itself, dragging him back to that first long night in the ER. He didn't hesitate, scooped her up, coat half-zipped, keys already in hand. Grace, who'd been in the kitchen rinsing dishes from dinner, dropped everything the moment she heard Jack's voice crack. "She's not breathing right," he said, his tone sharp, too loud, not directed at her, but hitting her anyway. "I'll come with you," she offered immediately. "No," he barked. "Just no. I've got it." Grace blinked, stunned. "Jack." "I said I've got it," he snapped, already halfway out the door. The drive to the hospital was a blur of red lights and prayers whispered under his breath. He held Emily's hand in the back seat, counting her breaths, trying not to imagine what he'd do if they slowed. Again. Inside the ER, nurses moved quickly, calm but firm. Jack stood back, fists clenched, unable to do anything but watch. The same helplessness, the same fear, it flooded him like it had that night Grace first found him in the waiting room. By the time the adrenaline ebbed and Emily was resting under observation, Jack sat alone beside her bed, head in his hands. Grace came anyway, quiet, careful, her heels soft on the hospital floor. She didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway, watching them, watching him. He didn't look up. "You didn't need to push me away," she said gently. "Not this time." Jack's voice was hoarse. "I couldn't let you see me like that again." "I've already seen you like that," she replied, "and I stayed." He stood, not meeting her eyes. "Every time I let myself believe this is real, something happens. Something reminds me how fast it can all be taken." Grace walked to him, close but not touching. "Then don't run from it. Let me be here, for both of you." But Jack turned back to Emily, his silence loud. Trust was easy to talk about, much harder to live. The hospital room was dim, lit only by the soft blue glow of a monitor and the slow, rhythmic beep that measured Emily's breaths. She was stable now, tucked beneath a blanket patterned with cartoon stars, her chest rising and falling with the steady grace of sleep. Jack sat slouched in the chair beside her, shoulders tense, hands clasped tight between his knees. He hadn't said a word in over an hour. He thought Grace would have left by now. Most people did. After the first crisis, they offered sympathy. After the second, they offered space. And by the third, they stopped offering anything at all. But not Grace. She sat in the corner of the room, coat draped over the back of a chair, legs curled beneath her, silent and still. Her presence wasn't demanding. She didn't ask for permission to stay. She simply stayed. When a nurse came in to check Emily's vitals, Grace stood and stepped aside with a nod. When Jack rose to stretch, she handed him the coffee she'd quietly gone to fetch. Lukewarm now, but still full. When the silence became too heavy, she didn't fill it with words, just a soft look, a hand gently resting on his shoulder. At one point he finally spoke. "You don't have to be here." She looked up, calm and unwavering. "I know. I haven't exactly made this easy," he added, voice low, ashamed. "No," she agreed. "But love isn't about easy." Jack stared at her for a long moment. His chest ached, not from fear this time, but from the unfamiliar weight of someone choosing to stay, over and over again. "She's all I have," he said quietly. "You're not alone, Jack," she said. "Not anymore. And neither is she." He swallowed hard, emotion rising in his throat like a tide he couldn't hold back. "You should have walked away." Grace gave him the smallest smile, the kind that said, "I could have, but never would." "I've done the walking," she whispered. "I'm done running from things that matter." So she stayed, through the night, through the fear, through the silence. And somewhere between the blinking lights and the steady pulse of a healing child, Jack Callahan let someone into his heart, fully, finally, without condition. Grace Whitmore was still there when the sun came up. The shop was quiet, the kind of stillness that only came after hours, when the clatter of tools had faded, the bay doors were locked, and the only light came from a string of bulbs Jack had hung above the workbench years ago, the ones that flickered a little but never quite gave out. Grace stood just inside the garage, watching him with that half-curious, half-amused look she wore whenever he got quiet in a way that meant he was thinking too hard. Her heels clicked softly on the concrete as she stepped closer, arms folded over her coat. "You've been fidgeting since dinner," she said with a smile. "You planning something?" Jack wiped his hands on a rag, then reached into a drawer beneath the bench and pulled something out. Small, wrapped in an old cloth he'd once used to polish carburetors. Nothing fancy, just his way. He held it out to her, eyes steady. Grace raised an eyebrow as she carefully unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a small chrome wrench, shiny, new, no more than 6 inches long. She looked up, puzzled, until she saw the engraving along the handle. "Together, always." Her breath caught. "I was going to do the whole thing," Jack said quickly. "You know, a ring, a dinner reservation, maybe even candles, if I didn't knock 'em over first. But none of that felt like us." Grace was silent, her eyes shimmering. "I wanted to give you something that meant something," he continued. "Something I know how to use, something built to last." She turned the wrench over in her hands, then looked up at him, really looked. "You're proposing to me," she said softly. He nodded, "With a lifetime warranty." A small laugh escaped her lips, cracked and tender. "You didn't even ask." He stepped closer, voice low. "Grace Whitmore, will you marry me?" There was no pause, no hesitation. She nodded, tears slipping free now. "Yeah," she whispered. "Yes, I will." He pulled her into his arms, grease-smudged and all. And right there in that old garage, among rusted bolts and hope made new, love said yes, quiet, certain, and built to endure. The morning dawned soft and golden, the kind of spring day that whispered promises through open windows. Maplewood came alive slowly, birds in the trees, distant lawnmowers humming, the scent of fresh earth rising from newly thawed ground. It wasn't grand or glamorous, it wasn't planned months in advance or featured in magazines, but it was theirs. Jack stood beneath a makeshift arch of wildflowers and repurposed auto parts, muffler pipe twisted into a heart, spark plugs tucked between peonies. His tie was slightly crooked, his boots were clean, if a little scuffed. He hadn't slept much the night before, but it didn't matter. Across the small green behind the community center, Grace stepped out from the building, hand in hand with Emily, both in soft ivory dresses that fluttered in the breeze. Her hair was pulled back in loose waves, no veil, no fanfare, just her, radiant in a way that made Jack forget how to breathe. People gathered in folding chairs, shop guys in flannel, cafe regulars, nurses from the hospital. Even Marcus wore a tie. The whole town showed up, not because it was a spectacle, but because they'd watched this love grow piece by piece. They knew what it cost and what it was worth. When Grace reached him, Jack took her hand, rough fingers curling around hers like they belonged there. The officiant was a retired high school teacher, with a warm smile and a wrinkled speech. But the words didn't matter as much as the way Jack looked at Grace, and the way Grace never looked away. "I don't have vows written down," Jack said, his voice thick. "But I know this. Every part of my life got louder after I lost. You made space for the quiet again, and I promise from this day forward I'll never stop choosing you, not when it's easy, especially not when it's hard." Grace smiled through tears. "I didn't expect to love again. I didn't expect you. But you gave me a home I never knew I needed, one with real walls, soft mornings, and a stubborn, beautiful heart. I choose you, Jack Callahan, every day, forever." They kissed, and the crowd cheered, and someone cried a little louder than expected. There were no chandeliers, no black tie speeches, just love, blooming quietly in a small town. And with that forever began, not loud, not perfect, just real, just enough, just right.